the interface. All right, let's begin by maybe doing a little bit of a compare and contrast between Land Desktop and in this case Land Desktop 2009. We flip over to Civil 3D, it'll be Civil 3D 2010. Just as an example, let's look at it from the context of I'd like to maybe bring some points in and build a quick surface, and then we'll go from there. Well, beginning in Land Desktop, if we just take a brief look at the menu, what we see is the menu is very pull-down driven. And as we look at some of the pull-downs, there are a fair amount of options available under each one. The reason for this is the application has evolved over the years from DCA to Sofdesk and then to Land, and the interface is still pretty much consistent with what was available in the late 80s. And as the program has evolved, additional options have just been attached to the interface. So while it is functional and many people are familiar with it, it is certainly not the most intuitive thing in the world to use. Next, the interface itself is modular driven, or it's based on workspaces. So you'll notice right now I'm currently working with Land Desktop Complete. If I were to switch to what would be a traditional Land Desktop menu, by selecting that option, we see that my pull-down menus change accordingly. If we'd like to do some roadway design or cross-sections, we would fire up the Civil Design module. That would give us access to those options. Perhaps maybe I'd like to balance a traverse or download a data collector. We would need to switch to Survey to update that information as well. So for the new user, we need to understand what we want to work with and what menu or workspace needs to be available, or maybe even go in and do some customization. You'll notice even with my screen resolution, which is certainly not small, I've got 2 lines of pull downs. I've actually seen situations where customers have had 3 lines worth of pull downs to be able to effectively use Land. So in addition to that, let's go ahead and bring some points in. I'm going to go to points. We'll come down, import some points from an ASCII file. And when I select that, I get one of the cumbersome things in Land, or challenges that we need to overcome, is that I cannot do any civil related commands at all. It's solely AutoCAD at this point unless the drawing is associated with a project. If it's not associated with a project, I can't look at points. I can't really do anything that is civil related. So for me to just bring some points in and build a quick surface to look at it, what I need to do is create a new drawing here. Let's give it a name. We'll just call it sample drawing. We'll create a new project to put it in. I'll call this project H. I'll select a template. Save changes to what I was in. No, that's because it's a single document interface. I then have to go through and verify some settings, what I'm going to use for text heights, what I'm going to use for sheet sizes, if applicable, coordinates, any rotation. By the way, never change that. Let's go ahead and set this to Leroy, maybe 10-point text. We'll finish. We'll say OK. It's a new project. That means new point database. We'll say OK. And after all that, I'm finally in a position that I can start looking at some points. All right, which is one of the painful things as it relates to Land or the interface in general, is I have to go through all this first, and I have to commit to a project before I can even look at any civil information. So let's go ahead and bring some point data in. We'll import. We'll go ahead and add those points to a group. We'll call it topo. We'll say OK. Because I'm connected to a database, how do I want to resolve any conflicts? We shouldn't have any because it's new. And if I zoom extents, there are the points that I've brought into the drawing. Now, once I come in, if I'm going to be connecting the dots or working with these points, it's not a dynamic environment, so I've got to find ways to resolve that, resizing those. In addition, if I'm going to do work with these points, for example, if I was to erase one or move one, maybe we back up, I've got one out here in space. If I don't need that, if we were to come to points, I have to remember that that's an edit operation, that there are special commands with which to deal with points. I can't use standard AutoCAD commands because this data is connected to a separate file. So things like move, copy, erase, even undo can cause me issues if I'm not using the correct commands. At the same time, even just standard AutoCAD workflow, I guess procedure-wise, if I select a point, right-click, it even presents me both options. I've got AutoCAD moves here. I've also got move specific to points down in this area. So once again, if you've got a new user, it's not the most intuitive thing. It's, when you're going to start confronting them with two options for move, having them immediately understand which one they have to use in which particular situation is probably not the best environment to work in. So next, let's go ahead and build a surface. If we're going to build a surface, I need to understand that I've got to go to Terrain to build a surface. Once I go into Terrain, there's not any options to create a surface. I need to know that I've got to go into the Terrain Model Explorer, and then from the Terrain Model Explorer, I can drill down and then create a surface. So once it's created, we need to expand, maybe add a point group to that. The point group we're going to add is the topo one we just created. And then once that's done, we need to remember it has to be built. Once it's built, we need to check the appropriate boxes depending on the data that we use. It's done building the surface. We get some information about that. And when we're done, we still don't see any surface. All right, we need to run yet additional commands to be able to see that on the screen. So we would have to do a quick view or something to that effect to be able to see the results of what we just accomplished. So it's fairly involved. There's a lot of commands that we need to deal with. It's certainly not intuitive. If it's something that we're, familiarity is different than intuitive. If we've used it for years, it makes sense because it really hasn't changed much. But somebody sitting down and using it from scratch, or a new user to get up to speed, it is a fairly challenging thing to get yourself familiar or accustomed to. In addition, we have to deal with special commands, a number of pull downs, it's a single document interface. We have to have it associated with a project drawing to be able to do any civil things. There's a large amount of things we need to overcome to be successful in Land Desktop. Now, in comparison, let's take and flip over to Civil 3D. Now, I'm in Civil 3D, as I mentioned before, Civil 3D 2010. One of the first things you notice is I have a white background. I've done that on purpose so that if we were to switch back and forth, you could immediately see which environment I'm in. White is Civil 3D, black would be Land Desktop. If we want to do something similar to what we did before, bring some points in and build a surface, well, the interface itself is laid out such that it is task-based. And it's got a ribbon interface on the top such that the relative commands for that particular task are brought together for us. So instead of saying point and what do I want to do, and then surface and what do I want to do, I can just say what I want to do and then select the object or the appropriate option from there. So for example, if I'd like to insert some points, we'll go to the insert operation. I'd like to insert points for a file, and you'll notice as I hover over any of these options, I get an expanded tooltip that will give me some further data about that. Let's add the same file we looked at before. I'm going to add that to a group with the same name that we did before. We'll call it topo. We'll say OK. And I'm in. So if I zoom extents, I see my points have been brought into the drawing. Now you'll notice I was not asked any information about what project and establish a bunch of settings and various things like that. The reason for that is I don't have to be associated with a project to be able to leverage civil commands. Do those options still exist? Absolutely, but they're not something that I have to go through and answer questions the first time that I come in. Now, once the points are in the drawing, a couple things. It's a dynamic environment, so if we come down to the bottom, we're immediately at 40 scale. I could switch to 20, and you'll see that the objects themselves will dynamically update, which is certainly going to facilitate connecting the dots or starting to draft up my topography. At the same time, if I hover over any object on the screen without even selecting it, it starts to drill down and give me information about the object, whether it be point number, elevation, northing and easting, or otherwise. If we come over on the side, Civil 3D has a tool space, and in that tool space there is a Prospector tab, which is kind of like the Terrain Model Explorer for everything. So instead of just giving us information for surfaces, it'll give us information about our points. We can select that, and we've got access to those throughout the item view at the bottom. I can grab any particular object in that list. Because it is an object, we can say zoom to. It immediately takes me to that within the drawing. So very, very intuitive, very easy to work with, very easy to navigate. It is a single application, so I don't have to worry about any special modules or anything to be loaded. It's not workspace driven to be able to do design operations or survey operations. It's also very task oriented. So let's explore that a little bit further. If I would like to come in here and construct a surface at this point, we'll come back to home, which is where I do my creation. We'll create a surface. All right, no special area we need to go into. The surface will have a name just like before. A style will be associated with that. For now, we'll just leave it at 2 and 10-foot background. So it's controlling our visualization as we go. So I've created the surface. What I'd like to do now is maybe modify that surface. So we'll say modify. I'm going to modify my surface data. And what we'd like to do? Well, I'd like to add some information to that. I'd like to add a point group. And the point group that we will add is our topo. We'll say OK, and our surface is immediately constructed. Now, we use the exact same data that we did before, and when we look at it, it's very easy to tell that there's an issue out here that needs to be resolved, as well as something out here that needs to be corrected. All right. In the civil environment, Civil 3D, we're able to identify that immediately because, as we create things, we see it immediately without having to it being generated in another file and then bringing it in from there. So if our intention was to edit the surface without knowing anything about the Civil 3D interface or how it works, simply by selecting the object on the screen, if we select that, it brings up all the commands that are relative to that particular object. So if we'd like to go in and start adding a line, swapping an edge, all of those options are available. If we'd like to come in and look at the options for perhaps rebuilding the surface, we could just drill into the surface properties and we can see those in here. So we'll get into surface information in that later, but the main point that I'd like to just point out is that there is a contextual menu within Civil 3D that will automatically, populate the task pane or the ribbon across the top of the screen for us with all of the relevant commands that we're not constantly drilling down into a number of different pull downs. At the same time, it is also a multiple document interface. So if I'd like to bring some data into here from another file without having to leave the environment and then come back, I could immediately open up another drawing. And let's say in that drawing file there's some tree information or something that's relative to my project. I'd like to see that as well. Well, let's maybe split the screen in half. So maybe that's a view operation. We'll split the screen so we can see what we were in before, what we're in now. I'm going to select one object. We'll right-click, say Select Similar, grabs all of those. We will copy that to the clipboard. Come into my drawing on this side. And we will say clipboard and then paste to original coordinates, and we see that tree line information appear within our drawing. Once again, the much easier to deal with than what we worked with before. So the interface itself is significantly more intuitive. We've got different tasks, or it's organized by tasks, and then various options that are available to us underneath each one. So it's a lot easier to learn, a lot easier to pick up. It has got a tool space that gives us a complete inventory of not only surfaces like the Terrain Model Explorer, but everything that may exist within our drawing, so we can drill down and see those things. It leverages ribbons, which it's basically the concept behind that. It's the right tool at the right time. So as we select things, we get contextual menus, so we don't have to dig down into different areas to find the commands we'd like to work with. I can use standard AutoCAD commands if we're going to erase or move. There's no special commands similar to what we had in Land. And then, at the end of the day, there's not a project requirement. I'm able to come in and investigate all of this data without having to tie this to any external files and be able to function from there. So at the end of the day, I guess the biggest point I would like to get across to anybody who is a Land desktop user who's currently watching this demonstration is that Civil may be different from Land, but for you to pick it up, at least the pieces necessary to leverage it as an effective tool within Land Desktop is certainly not a difficult thing to do. And if you're comfortable in the land desktop environment, this is certainly something that you'll be able to get up to speed and be productive very, very quickly.